Hey everybody, thanks again for joining us for what is now part 2 of our webinar with Bruce Tate on API design. We'll get into things quite quickly today, but before we do, a couple of little things. Bruce is running a small OTP course session with between 3 and 6 students this month, so he'll tell you a little bit more about that. There are still 2 conferences that will happen either in person or virtually. More on that from Bruce as well as they decide that. But Gig City Elixir and Lone Star Elixir, there'll be more news of that as it comes to hand. And the Groxio subscriptions for learning different programming languages. Right now, he's focusing on Elixir, and the next topic is OTP. So I'm sure for a lot of our listeners, very relevant topics. And then one other from us is that at the first week of June, on June 3rd, we will be running a Meet the Trainers / Future of the Beam webinar that will feature a lot of our most senior webinar guests, including Robert Verding, the co-creator of Erlang, Francesco, our founder, Mikhail Slasky, who is a developer with 15 years of experience and who also co-created the Lambda Days conference in Krakow, and Bruce Tate will also be joining as a special guest. So there'll be more info on that in the email, as well as there will be more info of everything else I just discussed and a recording of the webinar. You'll get that next week. As always, question and answers in GoTo or on Twitter. And with that, I'll hand over to Bruce Tate. Bruce, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's so great to do business with folks that you love, right? And the Erlang Solutions crew is definitely in that camp for me. So I know that we're all in this COVID lockdown. It's been a long time. Hopefully, over the next hour or so, we can take our minds off that a little bit and explore and think. So this session is going to be a lot of fun for me. I'm not really sure how it is going to be received. I haven't. This is a one-time presentation, so this is the only chance you'll get to see it. But I'm basically riffing on some ideas about my thought process when I think about designing an API. And so without further ado, this is part 2 of an API design series. We plan to go 3 parts. My name is Bruce Tate, AKA the person who wrote a book with James Gray, Designing Elixir Systems with OTP. When I originally imagined this series, it was primarily based on the layers in this book, and we'll talk about them in a little bit as we go. But I'm also AKA Red Rapids on Twitter. People say that you can't measure love. I measure it. Followers are love. And so let's get started. So I come from a company called Groxio Learning, and if you look at the Grox, that's kind of a riff on the word grok, which means to intuitively understand. If you look at the IO, if you look really closely at that, that's a 1 and a 0. So that's a computer language or binary. So it all means to intuitively understand programming languages. So it's also really short, and maybe that's the main reason. We have 3 things happening. One of them is that during the COVID lockdown period of time, at least through July, and maybe if the world is locked down for longer, we'll do it for longer. But we're doing small trainings at roughly conference training prices, or about $400 a person a day. And so these classes are short. There are small, short classes of 2.5 days, and they basically give you an opportunity to mob program through some interesting problems surrounding live view. Oh, that should say OTP. Let's fix that real time, right? Now you can really tell that this is a presentation that's a one-time and unrehearsed. So yeah, the OTP class is May 27th. I'm having a lot of fun with these. This will be the 3rd or the 4th one we've done, depending on whether another one books. Also, I help organize, actually, those of you who know us know that Gardner Tate on Twitter, Maggie Tate, organizes the Gig City Elixir and the Lone Star Elixir conferences in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Austin, Texas. We'll be making announcements, especially about Gig City Elixir, in the next 2 weeks. So watch Twitter for details. We'll make the announcements definitely on Red Rapids and Gig City Elixir, but we'll make the remote or in-person call then. And the last thing is that Groxio subscriptions, man, since we started this Joe Armstrong celebration with technologies that he inspired or that he worked on, with Elixir and OTP, and also Prolog, which inspired Joe. We're kind of working through those. So hope you'll join us. It's just $15 a month. We try to price it for the world market so that as many people can join in as possible. And it's really been a lot of fun to work through problems, no matter where you are in your learning. So we have a lot of independent study opportunities. We call them projects for the more advanced developers. We have videos that say, you type what I type, that are for more basic developers, and everything in between. So there's a little book, a little video. So that's what we do. So I want to talk a little bit about what we did last time for the people who are listening in for the first time. We talked about the idea that you should design your systems in layers. And the layers that we talked about were 2 fun things with big, loud worker bees: data, functions, tests, boundaries, life cycles, and workers. And that if you design the systems in that way, a lot of problems fall out. And we also talked about particular design patterns that are interesting to me when we're working through APIs. And one of them was the idea of a reducer, and we'll look at that a little bit more. And it's a design pattern that falls out of the use of Elixir pipes, where you have this constructor and then a series of reducers and then some type of transformer. But a lot of what we do, or a lot of what I try to think about when I'm building an API, is how to shape it in forms that are easy to understand and transform in Elixir. And sometimes that means width, and sometimes that means pipe. But so we'll look a little bit more about reducers, but we focused on that last time. And the last concept was a trapdoor, meaning that if you're building an API for an abstraction, sometimes it's nice to leave visibility to the abstraction that's immediately beneath. So I think that those concepts stood alone. Today, I'm going to be much more focused, and there's no live code this time because I wanted to talk conceptually. I want to talk about the idea of data first. And this is a tool, a thinking tool that helps me when I'm wandering through a concept for what an API will look like. And I want to look at it in conjunction with this particular problem space that's very difficult to think about. And in fact, the mapping of code onto database relations is something that has tripped up many a developer through the years. More people have gotten this wrong than right. But I think that Ecto is a pretty brilliant window into the minds of the people who designed it. Jose and Eric and some other folks as well that provided a lot of assistance. But I wanted to look at this as an example of a thought process that you might go through when you're designing an API. And I'm not sure how long this will take. My guess is that we'll spend more time than usual in questions, because it's just this is just a window into how I think about designing an API. So if we think of the do fun things with big, loud wildebeests, that concept is one that you see often in functional programming languages like Haskell or Scala or Idris or some of these emerging languages. that typically have stronger pipes, and you might see a layer between the boundary and the core that looks like a protocol that basically says that the implementation of the core can be independent or pluggable, if you will. And wrapping around all of this, we have an API that kind of sands out the rough edges, if you will, and makes the whole thing consumable. But I want to just riff a little bit and just kind of experiment with what if we were building an API for a database? How would we think about this, and what impacts might it have on our design? And really less than the design, but more the thought process as our API is emerging. So I think that when I started functional programming, the word function got the better of me, and I would tend to think about functions, about APIs as functions first. What functions make up the API? And with database, this is kind of a natural thing to do because we all know this acronym CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. And these are the operations that you have with a readable, writable, updatable resource. And so these become natural ways to think about how to design an API. But this doesn't work for me, and I'll try to explain why. I don't know if I can fully capture it here. You know, if so, great, then you have a little bit more knowledge. If not, great too. You have a little bit of insight into the way I think, and maybe something that won't work for you, and both of those are valuable. So let's take one of these, like the read. So philosophically, I can think of read as a function, and the simplest API to wrap around it is just to take options. And this is often a good place to start with a complex API. So think about what all the options are, and then divide things into buckets, and then decide what the overall API looks like. And then you can decide to give it more shape if it's an internal API with something like a struct, or with a specification if it's an external API. So we could start to think in terms of options, but inevitably we're going to be breaking this down into things that we can type and describe in our documentation. So maybe the first cut for us is I start thinking in terms of where I'm reading from. And so if I'm in Elixir, one of the things that I really try to do is respect the idea that in a module, like for example, this is a database API, maybe it's a database module. So the primary argument that I'm going to be working with, the first argument of as many functions as I can needs to be the database. And what's interesting about thinking about this problem in terms of the database and the query is that the database is a boundary concern. This is plumbing. This is going to typically happen. You're going to build this at config time, right? So the realm of code that you would use in Elixir is your config files, your mix.exs, your I don't know, your context, or not the context, but the application file. So the places that you configure your application. And the other side of that is very much, oh, this is a dependency, right? And so the other side of that is rather than configuring a dependency, we're building a first-class application concern. And so so if you think query, you might be tempted to put this type of code in the boundary. After all, it interacts with the database, but a query itself is very much a core thing. If you think about the core as something that's pure, right? So I can build a set of functions where if I start with a query that's on a table and then I add a filter to the query in the where clause, then that's a transformation that will always work. There's no user data involved. I'm just building a query. So this is very much an application time concern. And what's interesting about that is if I start thinking in these terms, I've got the database, which is a configuration time concern or like a build time concern. And then I have, or deploy time concern maybe, and then I have the query, which is the application time concern. And this API is going to be built exactly backwards in terms of the way that I'd like to consume it. Because basically, piping into a database into the read, which gives me records, is going to be a one-shot thing. Start with the database, pipe it into read, and get responses back, and I'm done. And so that's not a very composable way to think about this API. Or maybe we should look at the update, where I have this concept of a database and an item that I want to change, but then this other thing, which is in Ecto, it's the change set, but basically it's a policy for change. And at this early level in thinking about an API, it's hard for me to mentally jump across the elements like this and go from this jarring and make this jarring move from the read to the updates, where fundamental pieces of the read and the update haven't been designed yet. So I find myself getting a little bit frustrated with the way that the APIs are built, and getting into a headspace that actually is going to work for me. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's look at an API and another way to think about building them, right? So rather than thinking about functions first, you should think about data first. And I've got to admit, I went through a lot of years as an Elixir developer before I started doing this. So I started doing a little bit of this, and I can make it better after seeing the interfaces that Eric Meadows Jonnssön built and watching José's work with a plug API, which I think was just super brilliant. You had all these actions like redirects, and what José did was model them with data. And so I slowly started moving in the direction of data first. And then when James and I started working together on designing Elixir systems, he said the very first thing in his manuscript, he had a lot of ideas, and they were really aggressive, sharp, crisp ideas that we just kind of had to give shape. But the first sentence that jumped out at me in all of this like reams and reams of information was this sentence that said, "Start with the right data." And that just blew my mind. It really crystallized, it didn't teach me how to do something, it crystallized what I was already doing and gave me a tool for explaining it. So when I'm building an API, I can think about the W's, right? The where, what, and the whoa. No, that's how, right? That's an honorary W, is what I was trying to say here. But I can think about the W's. I can think about the configuration. I can think about when it's where things are coming from. I can think about the what. What is the core type of this function that I'm building? I can think about how to do something, and normally that's expressing a function as data in the API. But after I shape the data, and then I could build just a simple graph, just relating things on a page, just kind of in free form on a piece of paper, and I can start to shape what the major entities of the system are. So if you were building something like Ecto, maybe the core concerns, maybe you take the core concerns and then you look at them and then you decide which ones are going to get their own API. So maybe with Ecto, some of the things that you think about, some of the concepts that deserve their own data and some thought about the data before you ever move further are the ideas of a connection and a query and a change policy. And in fact, if you look at these are elevated to their own Ecto APIs. And if you think about them, each one of them has their angle on how to represent data. And some of these are just so interesting and almost shocking in the way that they're implemented, but they just give me great joy. So one of them is Ecto Repo. And so the Ecto Repo, the idea that's cool is that you don't see any functions in this module at all. You see this beautiful little bit of metaprogramming that says use Ecto Repo, and these are a few arguments. So this is actually a line of code from Groxio. And what actually happens is that the repo module itself gets functions and attributes dumped into it at compile time through the use of macros. So that Ecto Repo dot whatever function that you're working with carries some data about the connection as you're configuring the system. And then after you configure the system, then something else happens, right? So this is a boundary concern where the module has configuration data. And that's really cool to me. And we'll see the impact on the overall API, basically because Jose was brave enough to start with the data first. And so one of the interesting things of this is that at some point in the execution, the repo becomes an alias, becomes basically the name in an OTP registry so that this thing points to a process ID. So if you look at typical Phoenix code, you see that one of the things that started is the database repo, right? And where's the data for that repo? Well, it's in the repo itself and it's in the configuration, right? So every sliver of code is exactly where it belongs. So the configuration of the user IDs and passwords goes config.exs. The particular type of adapter that you're using and other application concerns go into the repo itself. And then Jonnssön or OTP has a supervisor that creates this repo, which is a Jonnssön, which is really cool to me. And then, it can start its own resources and on and on. So now when I use groxio.repo, I'm carrying the data with me. And I don't have to worry about what that first argument looks like. I like that. I like that concept. It's elegant and beautiful to me. So now I can start to think in terms of functions so that I have my repo, my inserts and my updates and my all or get to fetch data. So these are, the basic CRUD methods. And one of the things that starts to fall out of that is now I can start to drill down to the next step. So if we're dealing with the read, then Repo.all is going to require a query. And so I could start drilling down into that. And if you notice, this is another one of those APIs that starts with, James Gray calls it a token, like a token that moves around a game board, where that token is going from place to place, but it's really encapsulating information, all the information related to a single move in the game. So when I look at my code, sometimes I think about these, how to compose with these things. So I typically will build a lot of fragments as functions, and these are reducers, right? So these are reducers that take a query and return a query. And so I can start with some type of base query, and then I could scope it. Like this one, I could say, hey, just give me the emails of members, not just the guests on the site. And then I could pipe that query into a repo, which has the data related to a connection, which is super beautiful to me. So I want to talk about this idea of a reducer for a second. Last time we looked at this, and forgive me if this is too basic, but this is a very common Elixir design pattern, if you will. I know it's kind of a dirty, design pattern is a dirty word for functional programmers, but the idea that we have certain types of functions to start pipelines and certain types of functions that operate on Pythons on pipelines, on pipelines within a single module. So I have these constructors and then a series of reducers that keep me within a single module, and transformers that move me to other modules is really useful and helpful when you're building a very complex API and layers. And this is what it looks like in Ecto query land. So I have this concept of reducer, which is a function that takes data of some type and returns that same data type transformed, right? So it could have 0 or more arguments and still be a reducer in my book, even though it's not shaped precisely like an Elixir reducer. So, and in fact, you can look at this Ecto query. It's pretty easy to shape this as a constructor or a reducer, which makes it really cool. That means I can start pipelines with it, and I can end, and I can also use them as reducers in the middle of pipelines. Oh gosh, what just happened? My Keynote just quit. So let's see. Okay, are we okay? Are we happy? I think we're happy. We'll see. I don't think I've ever seen that happen before. So, okay, so we were on our Ecto query, and we were on the reducers, weren't we? Okay. So I have this reducer, and this reducer takes a query and returns a query. And basically, the nice thing about this is that I can use small functions like this to further drill down on a set. I can further filter data that I want to return or that I want to update. And so I could take this base query, which, remember, Ecto query can serve as the constructor, and then I can pipe that through a reducer like the one we just made called active. And I could pipe that through another reducer so I could continue to restrict the data that's coming back from a query. And then I can basically provide that as the first argument in one of the repo functions, like Repo.all or Repo.all. And since that's the first argument, then that can participate in a pipe as well. So this is part of the genius of taking that repo and building the data related to connecting to a database into that repo. It really makes the API beautiful to use. And so this isn't the only tiny bits of Ecto that I love. There are also, like for example, when we're looking at the change piece, I love the idea that I start with a schema, pipe that right into a chain set, pipe that right into an insert. That's an example from Roxio. where I have this contract that whether this thing succeeds or fails, whether the change succeeds or fails, it's going to, the API is going to respect it because it implements the OK tuple and the error tuple. So that's a nice little a bit of attention to detail that allows me to stay in pipeline a little bit longer, even though I'm on the boundary, which I love. So there's also the idea that I can take this thing and I can reduce over important elements of the change set that, this really starts in the line, the change, the attributes. The first argument is a change set, and I can string together a set of validations so I can compose with this just like I do a query, which means that our users don't have to be super naive to use our API. They can build one big, fat, ugly call to the database if they want to, or they can design it in layers with tiny chunks happening, one bit at a time. And I think that a lot of care and detail went into understanding, exactly how the consumers used an API and moving with those consumers. So Jose is a particular genius at this, and I greatly appreciate that. So basically, this is most of what I have to say, that you should just try the mental exercise of thinking about an API through the lens of data first. If it has some complexity and you're not sure exactly where it's going to go. And you can find examples in Elixir of this everywhere. Like, for example, we looked at Ecto, but you could also, there's a great API that I love to spend time with, and that's the plug API. So the idea that we started with this concept that a plug is a function, but then we said, okay, wait a minute. If a plug is a function, what are the reducers that we can apply to plug? I mean, so plug is a whole system of thinking in terms of API designs as reducers over data, and that's a wonderful thing to me. So we're going to open up for questions, but first I want to say thanks to a couple of people. First, Eric Meadows Jonnssön was one of the first people, was the first person besides Jose to work on Ecto. It might have been the first. He worked in the Google Summer of Code, and some of the decisions made in here, and the idea that we took a shot at one of the hardest problems in computer science, and that's mapping code that doesn't have a relational shape onto a relational database. They're basically working with the same thing. They got a lot right. And of course, Jose, you could see his love of code and concept and clarity often when you dive into Elixir. So love you both. Thank you both for building great software. I would love to kind of repeat the different things happening in Groxio and then open for questions. So remember, we have small training May 22nd. That's also OTP. So let's get that right for those who are chasing us in video. Okay, and then we have so watch Twitter for conference news, especially this next week. You're watching Gig City Elixir and you're watching Red Rapids. So in next week or the week after, we're going to announce local or remote as a conference. And then also Groxio subscriptions, just $15 a month, $150 a year. If you like these ideas, there's a lot more where these came from, and we've got Elixir, then OTP, and who knows? We've enjoyed the Elixir stuff so much, we may stay there for a module after this one, as long as we can come up with a programming model the whole idea with Groxio is to keep learning. So as long as we can come up with a programming model that keeps people learning and thinking, we'll do that. So I'm ready to open up for questions. So Anthony, I'll let you moderate the questions and kind of read them as they come in.
Perfect. Thank you again so much, Bruce. Just to let everyone know, we're taking questions here in GoTo and also on Twitter, so get them through to us while they're coming in. Just a reminder, early next week, you will get an email that'll include links to everything Bruce has spoken about, to our next webinar in June, a reminder of the next one of this series as well, and details about our first virtual conference, which happens at the end of May as well. So lots of cool stuff in there. The first question we've had through in the chat, Bruce, is, isn't an RDB relation first?
Isn't an RDB relation first? So yeah, I guess so. It depends on how you think about the API, right? So relation is also a hard thing, right? Because that can be a table or a query. But yeah, I mean, that's a decision that you've got to make. And you can see that if I go here, let's see, Ecto query, yeah. So if we go here, this is about where we landed, right? So so for member emails returns a query, which you could think about as a as a description of a relation. So yeah, it's definitely where we landed. So it's not what I think of when I try to build a database API first. I think in terms of, you also have to talk about connecting to the database and connecting to the database engine and all those issues. So yeah, I guess the answer to that question is yeah. It's
Cool.
you could think a relation first. That's a completely valid way to look at it, and that's definitely where we landed in this Ecto query, with the slight little curveball, if you will, on the idea that that we're also, the first argument to Repo.all is really the query, but the configuration is kind of built into the module and the Elixir configuration. So yeah.
Perfect. The next question in is, I'm writing a wrapper for an API. How should I return a response to a user that is using the module?
Read that again.
I'm writing a wrapper for an API. My question is, how should I return a response to a user that is using that module?
How should I return a response to that user who is using that module? Okay, so I think that I need a little bit more context to answer the question. Let's talk a little bit about. So I think that the spirit of the question is basically, what does the response look like? If it's not, forgive me, but if you look at this image, the actually, let's go forward one. There's the core, and you could think about an API without a boundary as a library, right? And so if I'm building something that's to be consumed by primarily by programmers, then I typically will try to keep my core as pure and as pipeable as possible, and I will let things crash when the data doesn't look like I expect it to, and I'll have an outer API layer that tries to keep the data in there pure. So there the answer is either the response is either going to be an OK tuple or OK or an error tuple. If things can go wrong based on the data that's passed in, but really I try to return just a value so that I can keep my core as pure as possible and try to deal with pipes in the core. And if I'm returning something from a boundary, then I'm almost always going to be building some error information into the boundary API. So to say that another way, one of the things that the Phoenix and Ecto libraries had to get right was how do we do validation? And so I think that when you get to that level, you're definitely dealing with tuple responses. And then the outer API layer, sometimes, if possible, you try to abstract some of that stuff away. But it really depends on the context of what's happening in the boundary or where you are in the stack, and whether you can trust the data that you're dealing with, and whether it's okay to whether it's better to crash or to provide more information to the user. Can your user act on the error? Otherwise, I'm afraid I've missed the question badly. So.
I did reach out to get more info and nothing has been forthcoming so far.
Great.
The next question we've got, and if nothing comes through, potentially the last, is how is the learning structured for the Groxio subscription, and is it something I could take at work?
So in terms of taking it at work, let me talk about the Groxio philosophy a little bit. I'd hate to make this a sales call because I want to respect Erlang Solutions time, but I think that there's a topic of general interest here. So let's make this question a little bit more abstract, and I'll point out that Groxio definitely subscribes to these ideas and it's implemented around them. So basically, we believe that it's very important for developers to learn. In fact, that may be the most valuable skill that we all have. So I was watching a presentation by the great Dave Thomas at Lone Star Elixir, and he talked about the Dreyfus learning model, and that struck me as the driving force between a lot of things in my career, but I'd never just put together exactly what was happening. So the Dreyfus model says that when you're a beginner, you learn differently than when you're an expert. And so the idea behind learning languages is to take yourself into that beginner's mind and progress the way that a beginner would, so that you, for example, like Groxio, one of the things that we do is a lot of video to support learners at the different levels, intermediate learners, beginning learners, and expert learners, depending on which module you're on. But the idea is that you ramp up from a beginner's mind to an intermediate, where you're getting more context and you're able to attack more problems on your own. Where maybe and so as you advance through the phases of the Dreyfus learning model, you need different types of material to learn. So the reason that I chuckled a little bit with can I get my boss to pay for it, or is it something that I can do at work? Here's the thing: if you have a boss that is overly obsessed with productivity now, and so the kind of boss who doesn't support other learning endeavors, it's going to be very difficult to get them to pay for the idea of, say, learning Pony, right? But I believe that bosses who do pay for projects without knowing where the benefit is going to come from, because they're teaching developers to learn, will be paid handsomely back for that experience. So, we try to say, we try to coach our users to approach their bosses and say, invest in me, help me learn to learn, give me this window to experiment, and I'll advance more quickly as a developer. So that's basically the idea. So in terms of what that material might look like, you might have book content, kind of the written word. You might have video content, and those are appropriate for like a somebody of middling experience to somebody that's a beginner. And we also have projects, which are test first projects that that you can implement one step at a time. That are typically, we just have a couple of those per module. They take a while to build, but they're really satisfying, and they really they really make you experience the pain, which is such an important part of the learning. So hope I didn't spend too much time on that, Anthony.
No, it's all good. We did have one more question come through, if that's all right, which is,
Sure.
how does this, and I'm unsure what this is in reference to, but how does this tie in with GraphQL?
How does this API design tie into GraphQL? So GraphQL is very much a data first API, and it's very much thinking in terms of data and reducers. So I think that probably another good, all of this is part of I don't know, you could call it event sourcing, which kind of is where do events come from? Let them flow through a system, and then let them modify a data model. These kinds of things work really well with the data first API design.
Perfect. That was the last question. There were a couple of shout outs to you from various members of the crowd, but that's it for today. I'll catch you and everybody else on the line in a fortnight. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. We'll see you again. Thanks, everybody.